So labas. Man džiugu pristatyti Andy Bachman su dukra. Ir mes sutarėm, kad jūs jau paskaitėt skelbime, kad jis yra rabinas iš Portlando, iš Amerikos. Ir bus paslaptis, apie ką jisai kalbės. Tai, bet jinai išaiškės jam bekalbant. Ir dar sutarėm, kad galima bet kada jį nutraukti ir užduoti klausimą, kas nori. Tai taip ir pradėsim. Manau, kad temos visos gyvenimiškos, žmogiškos, žydiškos, lietuviškos, pasaulinės, meilės ir taikos ir karo. Kaip rašė vienas mūsų rašytojas apie meilę, duoną ir šautuvą. Okay.
Oh, okay, good, all right. Yeah, my Lithuanian is non-existent. But thank you so much, Ilvius, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. This is my second trip to Vilna. I first was here in the summer of 2018. Every year for the last 10 years or so, I travel to Minsk each summer, and I'm part of a small group of American Jews and British Jews who put up memorials to the destroyed Jewish communities in Belarus. To date, we've dedicated about 120 different killing sites. And my interest in that actually goes back to my grandmother's life. My grandmother was born in Kapulya, or Kupel, outside of Minsk, and her town was destroyed by the Nazis in 1942, in August of 1942. And we dedicated a memorial in Kupel, and every summer would do 5 or 6 towns, and the summer of 2018 came to Vilnius and Kaunas, to Vilna and Kovno, to see these very important cities in the grand history of the Jewish people. And I'm here again visiting my daughter Minna, who is a student at McGill with her best pal Jonas, and who's here with his father Stasis, who hosted us for a wonderful dinner last night. It was delicious, and makes a great vegetarian lasagna and wonderful homemade wine. So I've been shown great hospitality on both of my visits, and I'm really, really happy to be here. I want to actually begin in a way that I didn't think I was going to begin, but this library is really, it's like a miracle itself. You know, for a Jew to come to Vilnius, you know, in 2024, just as it was for me in 2018, is to be confronted with the absence of Jewish life and Jewish history because of the Shoah. In the mind of literate Jews throughout the world, Vilna, as everyone knows, was known as Yerushalayim Shalita, or Yerushalayim Delita. It was the Jerusalem of all of Lithuania. It was the center of some of the greatest yeshivas in Jewish learning, but equally to the point, it was also a center for an incredibly rich, diverse, vibrant, secular Yiddish Jewish culture. What I often try to point out to students when I teach in universities or in high schools about who the Jews are is I tell the story of one visit that I took to the Jewish Museum in Warsaw, and there was a display of all of the different Yiddish daily newspapers that were in Warsaw before the war. Right? We know that there were somewhere between 25 and 30 different Yiddish daily newspapers, right, throughout the greater, you know, Poland area, of which obviously Vilnius was for a certain time in its history, that people often think of a kind of typical Jew who was killed in the Shoah was a religious Jew and all of those traditions that were kept by Orthodox Jews, but in fact, the richness and the wealth of secular Jewish life, and in particular as it related to the Yiddish language, was in some ways a wiping out of Jewish history that can never, ever fully be replaced. You know, one of my teachers throughout my own rabbinical education, Arthur Hertzberg, whose many of his books I've seen around the room, a great American rabbi, came from the town of Belz. The town of Belz was entirely destroyed in the Shoah, But the Belzer Rebbe, who had survived, wound up in Jerusalem and restarted the Belz Yeshiva that now has in it more Jews studying just in the Belz Yeshiva than were in the town on the eve of the Holocaust. Orthodox Jewry, to some extent, was able to kind of not replace who had been lost, but to rebuild an observant Jewish life in a way that secular Judaism or secular Jews have never really been able to do. The fact that young people around the world, my daughter Minna included, is studying the Yiddish language is a wonderful thing, but we'll never ever see a time in which any city is going to put out, 25 Yiddish dailies and things like this. And so standing here in this really wonderful space, this library is something of a miracle and a testimony and a haven and a source of tremendous inspiration for people who will be continuing to come through Vilnius, like I have and like many tourists do, wanting to touch the Jewish past and to be able to be in this room and pick up books and see pictures and displays and really experience, if you will, in a kind of first-hand way, this curated story of Jewish life it's really marvelous. So I just want to commend you for building this wonderful library. I was reminded, and this is kind of the way into the talk that I wanted to actually take, I was reminded of my own journey as a young person when I was 20 years old, Minna's age about, and I grew up in the city of Milwaukee, which is where my Jewish family migrated to fleeing pogroms in Europe at the turn of the century, 1900s into the 20th century, and went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And I was a history student, but I was interested in Jewish questions. And the place where I went in Madison, Wisconsin, was the Jewish Library, which was actually at the Hillel House. Right? Hillel is a movement in Judaism where college students can go for learning and Shabbat and different kinds of Jewish experiences. And the Hillel Library in Madison, this is like giving me huge flashbacks to the times in which I wouldn't go to class or would try to skip my classes and just go hang out in the Jewish library, because that's really where I wanted to do all of my Jewish learning. So I start with a kind of memory, but also a prayer that future generations of seeking students will find refuge in this library that you've built and allow their learning to be expanded and deepened in this incredible story of the Jewish people. So I'm a rabbi, as you probably know. And I became a rabbi primarily because of a kind of major generational shift that had taken place in my own family. And I want to describe that shift through a very famous Hasidic tale that was told by the Baal Shem Tov. You might have heard of the Baal Shem Tov as the kind of the founder of Hasidic thought. It was considered the first Hasidic rabbi, and was considered also something of a miracle worker. People believed that the Baal Shem Tov had special magical powers and could save the people if he prayed to God fervently enough. And so it's said of the Baal Shem Tov that he had a tradition where if his community felt that it was in danger, he would go to a special place in the forest, he would light a fire, and he would say prayers to God to save his community. And it would generally work. The Baal Shem Tov dies. He had a disciple who was called the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich then had the responsibility of praying to God on behalf of his people. But he didn't know how to light the same kind of fire that the Baal Shem Tov could light, but he knew the prayer, and he knew the place in the forest. So he would go there, wouldn't light the fire, say the prayer in that spot, and the people would be saved. His disciple was someone named Moshe Leib of Sesov. He didn't know how to light the fire. He didn't know the prayer, but he knew the spot in the forest to go to. And so he would just go stand in that spot, and the people would be saved. He had a disciple named Reb Israel of Rizhin. He didn't know how to light the fire. He didn't know how to say the prayer. He didn't even know the place in the forest to go. But he created the story that I just told you. I think of my own family. My great-grandfather, Chaim Segal, who was Chaim Segalovich in Belarus, was studying to be a rabbi before pogroms chased him out of Belarus, and he went to America, and he was a burlap bag factory owner. He made burlap bags for all sorts of things that were part of the agricultural industry in Milwaukee. He was a leader in the Milwaukee Jewish community. He raised my grandmother and her brothers. My grandmother had 2 sons. And in 1942, during the Shoah, I'm convinced she knew about what happened to the town that she fled in 1903, never spoke of it her entire life. I only found out that 32 members of my grandmother's family were killed in 1942. It was a secret in our family, but the lists were right in front of my eyes when I first visited a couple in 2016. My grandmother made the decision that, like so many of her generation of American Jews, it was more important to be American than it was to be Jewish. That Jews who, as Arthur Hertzberg and many other great historians of American Jewry have taught us, many of the Jews, of the nearly 3 million Jews who migrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920, most fled Europe also in order to flee their persecutions, but their Jewish identities as well. Changed their names, shaved their beards, took off their tzitzit, right? Stopped keeping kosher. This was a classic maneuver that many millions of American Jews took because they wanted a new American identity and they wanted not to be saddled with ancient traditions. They wanted to embrace modernity. Well, she raised my father, 3rd generation American, to be an American. He graduated from high school 2 years early, went to college, fought Hitler in the Second World War, came back, worked in business. And when he married my mother, who was not born Jewish, made the distinct decision certainly not to send us to Hebrew school, not to give me and my sisters a bar bat mitzvah, but to teach us sports and take us to the best schools so that we could go off and live good, productive lives as Americans. Here I am, as a 4th generation, just like Israel of Rishon, standing in this Hillel library wondering, but who's going to tell the story? Who will tell the stories that we inherit and make sure that the flame and the prayers and the remembrance of, or even the place in the forest, continue to exist? And that's essentially why I became a rabbi. It was for very practical reasons. I just sort of came to a realization one day that if I didn't roll up my sleeves and learn Judaism and understand what it was all about and then teach it to the next generation, that at least that element of my family line would die out. And I was just bound and determined not to let that happen. I'm actually very typical for a lot of Jews of my generation. Of course, most of them did not decide to become rabbis, but I'm fairly typical in terms of being raised in a secular way, embracing all of the benefits of what America had to offer anyone who came to America. And the realization, however, that a core element of Jewish identity may come to an end is what spurred me on ultimately to go into rabbinic service. So what I want to try to talk about this evening is where 100 years later from my own family's immigration to the United States, where American Jewry actually is at today. And it's an interesting question to ask because Jews have actually been living in the United States since the founding of the American project. There were Dutch Jews from the Spanish-Portuguese tradition who were among the first immigrants to the United States, to Manhattan Island, then called New Amsterdam, eventually obviously called Manhattan. Following that early wave of Spanish-Portuguese Jews coming to the United States in the 1600s, you have waves of German Jews who are fleeing the failed revolutions of 1848, who come to the United States, moderately wealthy, successful in business, very enterprising, and who quickly rise up through the ranks of any number of states throughout the country that are still in formation. United States starts as 13 colonies, becomes 13 states, doesn't become 50 states that we are still today until well into the 20th century, right? With Alaska and Hawaii being the last two added. Jews, and especially German Jews, are part of that process of actually building up the United States throughout the early 1800s and into the late 1800s, rising to the level of not just business leaders, but mayors and even governors of certain states, and finding great success in the process of both assimilating into American life, but also becoming a part of the process that actually builds the country itself. With the rise of the pogroms in the 1880s, millions of two mass movements essentially begin to take hold. One is nearly 3 million Jews who migrate from Eastern Europe to the United States, changes the face of American Jewry immediately, brings the Yiddish language over to the United States, brings more religious expression and more religious traditions over to the United States, brings over a whole host of Jewish communal institutions that were very much a part of Jewish communal life in Eastern Europe and reestablishes them in the United States, burial societies, charity societies, educational societies, a vast network of a kind of recreated European Jewish life brought to and Americanized on the American shores. And then the other major migration, not nearly as large as number, but ultimately in significance, were the thousands and then tens of thousands of Eastern European Jews who made the decision as European Jewry was falling apart under the threat of violence and became Zionists and moved to first Ottoman Palestine and British Mandate Palestine and began to build the State of Israel. I bring up these two migrations for a very kind of interesting reason, because while you have the mass of European Jewries migrating mostly to the United States and a relatively smaller number of Jewry moving to what is now Israel, Palestine, and then you have still, even with more than 3 million Jews in the United States and ultimately a couple 100,000 up to 600,000 just before Israel was established in 1948, you still have millions of Jews and the vast majority of Jewry living and staying in Europe. And of course we know the Shoah changes all of that, right? Suddenly changes all of that. And you have this strange balance. It's really an imbalance in terms of population, where you have the massive world Jewry concentrated in the United States by 1948, fewer than 1 million people living in Israel. But if you fast forward to today, and we just passed this number demographically a couple of years ago, you now have more Jews living in the State of Israel today than you do in the United States. A major demographic shift has taken place, which 100 years ago was completely inconceivable. I like to explain to people that in 1910, when Tel Aviv was just being founded as a city, basically, 1909, 1910, it was founded by 52 families. 52 families founded the city of Tel Aviv. Today, the greater metropolitan area of Tel Aviv, 3.5 million Jews. Like, think about that. Like an inconceivable change, right? And these kinds of changes that we can't imagine even happening at the time that we're experiencing the beginnings of them, ultimately end up 50 years later, 75 years later, 100 years later, teaching us something that I think is profoundly important for us to look at and reflect on. So I once, some years ago, Ms. probably is not old enough to remember because she was quite young at the time, I gave a sermon on Rosh Hashanah Eve to my large congregation in Brooklyn, and I had just been reading an Amos Alon biography of Theodor Herzl, which I saw somewhere on the shelves here. Herzl, you might know, who's one of the founders of Zionism, very famously wrote his book Der Judenstaat while covering the Dreyfus trial in France. And Herzl grew up in Vienna. And around the same area where Herzl lived, Sigmund Freud, Herzl, the composer Gustav Mahler, and the novelist Arthur Schnitzler, who, if you've ever seen Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, that short story that he wrote is the inspiration for that film. So for you cultural studies, linguistics majors, if you've not seen that movie yet, you should. It's his last movie he made that he couldn't even finish because he had died. Anyways, so in this sermon, I was trying to paint a picture of what people thought the image of world Jewry would look like in 1903. You know, when if Freud and Herzl and Schnitzler and Mahler are bumping into each other in a cafe in Vienna, versus what the world actually looked like. I think I was giving the sermon in, like, let's call it 2006 or 7 or 8, whatever. So I said, by show of hands, just for sake of argument, by show of hands, how many of you talked to your therapist this week? And, I don't know, there were 1,500 people there for Rosh Hashanah Eve. Maybe 1,000 people raised their hands. I mean, New York Jews, everyone's got a therapist, right? So everyone raised their hands. Yeah, I spoke to my shrink this week. I took the week off, but I'm speaking to him next week, But everyone talks to a shrink. I said, okay, by show of hands, how many of you went into your rabbi's office and had a conversation? I think like 3 people raised their hands. I said, so just by one measure, perhaps at the beginning of the 20th century, Sigmund Freud was right about who Jews would actually want to talk to, as opposed to talking to a rabbi. Secondly, and I think this was close to the year when there were more when the population studies showed that there were more Jews living in Israel than were actually living in the United States. I said, secondly, who thinks that Israel has the largest number of Jews in the world, and who thinks the United States has the largest number of Jews in the world? Only to demonstrate, of course, and I use this example of Tel Aviv going from 52 families to, just Tel Aviv itself, 3.5 million people. Things change, things happen in inconceivable ways. So that the privilege of us, living in the future, is to be able to draw some conclusions and some lessons, and then ultimately return to that story of Reb Israel of Rizhin and ask ourselves, how will we tell the story? We can no longer recreate the vanished past, but how can we tell the story about it in a way that will make other next generations feel compelled to, at the very least, tell the story as well? So one of the things that we American Jews talk about quite a lot these days is a very famous study. That bad, eh? Okay. It's a very famous study, I know. What can I tell you? Sorry, man. I'm really, really sorry. I thought it was going to go much better than this. One of the stories that we American Jews talk about a lot is something called the Pew Study. There's a famous demographic organization in the United States that does population studies, and it did a very, very deep dive into the behavior patterns of American Jewry. And it's become a kind of boilerplate, a set of ideas that does paint a fascinating portrait of where American Jews are at. And I want to just share some of them with you as a kind of jumping off point to talk about where I think we might possibly go in looking at a thriving, surviving Jewish community in the United States. The first thing the study showed is sort of what I alluded to before. Jewish population, for the most part, has stayed stable for the last generation in the United States. How many Jews, anyone want to guess how many Jews live in the United States right now?
More than in Israel.
No, fewer than in Israel. Fewer, yeah, about 7.5 million Jews in the United States. Israel at this point is about 7.8 million Jews, which is quite interesting. What's interesting is that Jews, however, are becoming much more ethnically diverse. It used to be that, it used to be that an intermarriage in the Jewish world was a German Jew marrying an Eastern European Jew, right? This was an intermarriage. Or a Galicianer marrying a Litvak. This was an intermarriage. These things aren't supposed to happen. But especially in the age range between 18 and 29, we're seeing larger numbers of Jews who identify as Jewish and Asian, Jewish and Black, Jewish and Latino. That the openness of America and the open ways in which people partner with each other increasingly means that younger American Jews have multiple ethnic identities, right? Something that had never been conceived of and considered before. Secondly, and this is increasingly true across all religions in the United States, And again, it's most pronounced among younger people, but unquestionably more and more people are becoming less religious. More people are proudly expressing that they don't believe in God. They still might identify as Jews, but they certainly don't do any religious practice as Jews. They don't study Torah, they don't go to synagogue and pray, they certainly don't keep kosher. So religious practice is down, even though identification remains the same, which leads to a whole other question of then what do people identify as when they identify as Jewish, and we'll get to that in a second. How many people do something in a religious way on a weekly basis? What percentage? Only 12% of American Jews. Where I'm in Portland, I just joined a synagogue, conservative synagogue, where I go and pray every Saturday. They say that they have 300 families. And we're lucky, which I guess you can multiply out to be, call it 600-700 people. Maybe if we're lucky, there are 20 or 30 people every Saturday morning, which kind of, that is the percentage. 10 to 12% actually go do religious stuff in any population. 80% of most non-Orthodox Jews say that they're Democrats. When they vote in elections, they vote for Democrats. Somewhere between, and it fluctuates between 71, 72, and 80% always vote for Democrats, right? Which means very few vote for Republicans in most elections. But if you're an Orthodox Jew, nearly 50% vote for Republicans, right? Which is also very interesting just to kind of think about. 75% of all American Jews in the last 10 years see a very significant rise in anti-Semitism. Across the board, across all age groups. 82% of American Jews, when polled, 82% of American Jews say they care about Israel. But more than half of American Jewry totally disapproves of Benjamin Netanyahu. And more than 60% of American Jewry still believes in a two-state solution, believes that Israelis and Palestinians should have two states living side by side. Now, there are some demographic studies that since the Israel-Hamas war in October, that some of those numbers are fluctuating wildly because a lot of things are changing as a result of that war in both ways. It's made more conservative Jews even more conservative, and it's made liberal Jews even more liberal, and it's also made liberal Jews less liberal, and more conservative Jews. This war has upended a ton of assumptions. We don't really know where this all ends in terms of opinions of American Jewry, but for the most part, what continues to emerge is a strong disregard for Netanyahu and a fervent belief that ultimately the solution is going to mean a two-state solution and sharing and live space on the land. Interesting. So if Jews don't go and do religious things, only 12%, what is interesting is that 72% say they like to do Jewish cultural stuff, but it doesn't really relate to actually anything that is connected to the Hebrew language or the Yiddish language, obviously. Which raises a whole other question, which is how does a culture actually sustain itself if language isn't at the center of that cultural expression? And I think there's no place that's in a way more chilling to ask that question than in Vilna. What happens to Jewish life when the language of Jewish life disappears, right? Very, very important question to ask. Just a couple of last observations, and then I want to maybe share some ideas and some what you could say might be responses to this kind of portrait of where American Jewry is at. It used to be the case, this was the other point from my sermon, which I forgot to mention. It used to be the case 100 years ago that the great saving grace of an idea for how American Jews should be organized is to divide up American Jewish life into denominations. Reform Jews, conservative Jews, and Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews keep all of the traditions, all 613 commandments. Conservative Jews keep most of them and keep kosher and are literate in Hebrew. Reform Jews pick and choose what they do and don't really observe everything and oftentimes conduct their services in English. And this really was the case for most American Jews, proudly so, would identify strongly with denominations. But when you come down again to the 18 to 29 generation, nearly 50% of people under the age of 30 don't identify with any of the movements whatsoever. Don't see themselves as Reform or Conservative or Orthodox Jews. They just see themselves, if they identify as Jews, they simply see themselves as Jews. And this is also a very significant development because it means that 100 years ago, when leaders of American Jewry thought that they were mapping out the ways in which Jews could organize and self-identify, and that this was going to be the new structure that was going to undergird American Jewish life, it turns out 100 years later they were wrong. It turns out that they were wrong. And that in fact, Jews will still identify as Jews, not religiously, but by doing cultural things, and will happily and freely marry who they want, love who they want, configure their families in the ways that they choose. And so I think from this we can, fairly establish that the overarching theme that has really influenced American Jewry more than anything over the last 100 years, 150 years, has been that great prevailing idea encoded in the beginning of the American Declaration of Independence. This famous line, which I'll quote. This is what the founders wrote when they created the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, not women, not blacks, not slaves, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the individual quest for personal happiness, I want to do this because that makes me happy, is kind of on one hand, a beautiful expression of the American ideal. On the other hand, it's an expression of utter selfishness that arguably is just continuing to ply at the erosion of Jewish values, which are really much values centered around the idea of what it is that the people does and how it is that the people forms itself wherever the people live. So America really represents this incredible tension between people's desires to express themselves as individuals versus Judaism's values, which are really all about living within the walls, if you will. I hate to use the word walls, but we'll use it. Living within the walls of the communal, of a sense of what it means to be a part of a community of people. And so a lot of leaders in American Jewry over the course of the last, certainly since the Pew Study came out, but it's really been the great challenge of modernity for many people, which is to find out what it is that can be a driving force to inspire people to continue to want to tell Reb Israel of Rizhin's story, to tell the story of the fire and the flame and the place and the prayer that actually sustains who the Jews are as a people. So here's a few things that we actually know that work. Okay? Jewish summer camp. Jewish summer camp is probably the most successful invention in the 20th century for American Jews. It's a place where children get to go away from their parents, but still be Jewish, live a Jewish life all day long, right? All summer long, from Shabbat to Shabbat, and really kind of set their own agenda, if you will, for what their identity and what their expressions of Jewishness are. Demographers generally say that a child who goes to Jewish summer camp every summer for 4 to 6 weeks, by the time they turn 18, will identify as Jews for the rest of their lives. I mean, this is just a fact. We know this thing. They say that just 4 or 5 summers at summer camp is equal in value to sending a kid to Hebrew school for 12 years. You know what changes everything for young people? 2-week trip to Israel equals 5 to 6 years in summer camp, 12 years of Hebrew school. One kid going on one trip to Israel for 2 weeks and kind of learning their history in real terms on the land, if you will, with the Hebrew language, is actually a huge influence on inspiring young people to identify as Jews. This leaves aside, anything that anyone wants to say or think about the politics of Israel or the politics of Zionism or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Undeniably true that the Jewish people's original home is in the land of Israel, and the experience of going there and being there and touching that has an enormously powerful effect. So in communal places, these end up emerging as the kind of priorities, if you will, of trying to inspire a younger generation to identify as Jews. One of the most successful programs of the last 25 years in American Jewish life has been the Birthright Israel program, sending hundreds of thousands of American Jews on a 10-day trip. It's turned out that it has it has an enormously powerful and positive impact on identity formation. Second, summer camping, a huge impact, continues to have a huge impact. Many families will not elect to send their kids to Hebrew school, won't even be members of a synagogue, but they'll send their kids to summer camp because they know that that's a kind of environment where they can have a positive experience and a positive impact on one another. We're seeing something very interesting. I, for 7 years, ran the Jewish Student Center at New York University called the Bachman Center, and we had a Jewish Studies department at NYU. And it occurred to me one day when I was walking through the empty rooms of the Hillel on campus, knowing that there were about 200 or 300 kids taking Jewish studies classes at NYU. And so you actually now have, across American Jewry, a preponderance of Jewish studies programs in universities. Because Jews still have the tradition, even though the yeshivas of Vilna are gone, Jews still have a tradition of valuing learning and of placing learning and the life of the mind at the center of one's intellectual and spiritual, if you will, or pursuits of meaning. And so Jewish studies departments continue to grow and expand, where you can study Jewish history, and you can study Jewish culture, and you can study Israeli history and Israeli culture, and you can study the Yiddish language, and all of the things that, if you will, adhere to kind of the Pew Studies description of people eschewing religious expression, but really wanting to maintain a connection to a cultural sense of identification as Jews. And then lastly, one of the things that we actually know, and this has always been a part of American Judaism, we tell stories of rabbis who marched with Martin Luther King, and rabbis who always fought for civil rights, and rabbis who are and Jews who are at the forefront of the right to an abortion in the United States, or Jews who are at the forefront of the equal rights movement for women, or Jews who are at the forefront of equal rights for gay and lesbian individuals in the United States. One of the things that's very much at the core as well of a secular Jewish identity is what we call social justice Jews, tikkun olam Jews, the idea that because we were once slaves, because we once experienced a genocide, we ourselves are obligated to making sure that those types of things never happen again in the world. And so Jews, again, will not go to shul, will not speak Hebrew, will not observe any of the commandments, but if they are on the front lines at a protest, that's an act of being Jewish. And so, unexpected results. Is it like Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, standing in his own home, not knowing how to utter the prayer, not knowing how to light the fire, not even knowing where the place in the forest is? But if we can tell the story, then somehow that fire remains lit. So with great, great, great humility, I return to the Jerusalem of Lithuania to share what I hope will be words of hope for a Jewish future. One can never completely remake the past, but one can know the past and carry it forward by telling the stories of the past, and to build a flame that will inspire others to make Jewish choices into the future. So I'm happy to take questions and responses, and I thank you for your patience.
Do any American Jews have this feeling of going to Israel and settling there?
Actually moving there?
Yeah.
Well, always it remains amongst Orthodox Jews. It's been more than a couple of generations now that the largest number of Jews who leave America to go live in Israel are Orthodox Jews. Zionism as a movement has not been successful at convincing non-Orthodox Jews, or I would say secular Jews, in mass to move to Israel. And that's a fact. And people will argue that this is for many reasons. Number one, there is an aspect of the way in which the Orthodox education, the educational system, instills in its young people a love for the Hebrew language and a love for the historic land of Israel. It's very common, for instance, in the yeshiva world in the United States, after the senior year of high school, after the last year of high school, Jewish boys and girls will then go and they'll spend a whole year studying in Israel. At 18. There's enormous peer pressure to do it because all your friends are doing it. But what that, again, if you think that, a few summers in summer camp are a positive, expression of Jewish identity, living in Israel for a year will change you no matter what. I mean, sometimes it radicals people to be anti-Zionist. But for the most part, people get and understand that that this is the Jewish homeland, and they choose then to live there. That's a big, big, big piece of it. Language and the practice of language, in this case the Hebrew language, is absolutely central to that. And it's, you could argue it's a kind of failure of the non-Orthodox movements that by not instilling facility, fluency, a love for the Hebrew language in its Jews, cultures fade really quickly when languages fade. That's one of those sad facts of life. And so for the most part, that the first piece has to do with the educational system, and the second is it's a very hard life, and America offers a lot more opportunity in a way. And Israel has been in basically a constant state of war since its founding, since before its founding. So it's a huge commitment to make the decision that you're going to go and live in a place whose future remains unresolved and whose future you will have to fight for or fight against or whatever it is. You are engaged in an existential fight for being Jewish when you become an Israeli. And, many non-observant American Jews are like, I'm very fine and happy being Jewish in America, and I don't have to fight for my life while I'm here as a Jew yet. But it's generally for those two reasons. It's a good question. Yes.
The summer camps is language a key component of them, or is not? You're saying kids go there and they develop an identity, and yet I didn't hear you answer your own question. How do you preserve the culture?
Yeah, I mean, my experience of teaching in Jewish summer camps and sending our daughters to Jewish summer camps. Look, the answer is yes. Language is a big piece of it. Kids don't go to Jewish summer camp and come out speaking fluent Hebrew, but on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, they hear more Hebrew over 6 or 8 weeks than they will in a whole year. So certain aspects of it really, truly seep in, and that has a huge effect, It has a huge effect on identity development. Yeah, good question. Yes, Minna.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, I guess, I have 2 questions for you, actually. One is, why aren't I fluent in Hebrew? And what bearing does that have in your eyes on my Jewish identity?
It's an excellent question. I mean, you did start Hebrew at McGill, yes? And you didn't continue it?
After a semester.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, in a way, you sort of answered your own question. I mean, your mother and I made the decision to send you to public school because I was a synagogue rabbi and you were in the eye of the storm of the community, and we were also, as apropos of committed to the values of democracy and diversity of American life, we wanted you in public schools because we felt that would be an invaluable education. The public schools that you went to didn't offer Hebrew language. Summer camp did. Trips to Israel did, that we took as a family. And then, we're very typical, guilty as charged on a certain level. I studied Hebrew in Madison, which then inspired me to go to Hebrew University, which inspired me to become a rabbi and fluent in Hebrew. But you were given choices, and this was part of our ethic as a family, that all the kids had choices in terms of what they would study as and choose to study as young adults.
Okay.
So I think that's why. It's not your fault, but we sort of made the decision to lead you as far as we could leave you, given all of our commitments that we had to the kinds of broader education we wanted you to have. And then, hey, when you told me you enrolled in Hebrew, I was thrilled, so get back at it if you can, maybe.
Maybe. My second question is,
suggestion.
as a rabbi or like Jewish leader, like regardless of the context, pulpit, like book, like wherever you are, what is your most asked question among like young American Jews? Like what do they most ask? What have you found are people most curious about today from rabbis or from like Jewish leaders?
I think that across the generations, but I certainly see it in young people and always have, and my work is always geared toward gathering younger people, trying to bring them back into the community. I think the search for, the yearning is a word we like to use, for community. I think that the world is a very alienating place. I think for younger people especially, to grow up in an age of global warming and the existential threat to the planet can make life very depressing and lonely. And I think that Jews as a community, in many ways, one of our greatest gifts to the world is that we have this practice of only praying in a community of at least 10. That we don't have a tradition of monks in Judaism. We don't go into solitude. I mean, the Hasids did, but that's why no one can find their way back to the forest. That shows you what solitude will get you. I don't know, he went there, I don't know where it was. But we Jews have this notion of praying in a minyan of 10, and community is always at the center. When Jews came to the United States, we had a tradition that goes all the way back to when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, which started the first major real Jewish diaspora. We already had the tradition of Kaddish, of saying the prayer for the dead, which is required in a minyan. We already had the tradition of tzedakah, that one had to make sure that the poorest in the community could be fed and were taken care of. We already had the tradition of what's called gamach, which is gimilut chesed, like charity pots. So that when the United States Jewish life began to flourish with the huge migration of these 3 million Eastern European Jews who came to New York, for instance, and you can still see little remnants of this if you've ever done a Jewish tour of the Lower East Side in New York. We had these things called Landsmannschaften, which were, the Bialystoker shul in the Lower East Side. If you're from Bialystok, you might see cousins in this shul, or so on and so forth. And each Landsmannschaft set up money for schools, money to buy cemetery plots, and charity money. So, you can argue that, education, communal responsibility to the disadvantaged, and where are you going to put your dead are three essential questions that really have at the foundation what it means to live in a community. So I find that young people are searching for that. They often don't have the language for it. It's not like people come up to me like, where can I get a good cemetery plot, Rabbi? But that sense of yearning for community is one piece. And then the other is, in terms of the agony that young Jews today are feeling. I mean, I think that there's an enormous amount of agony over Israel and what's happening in Israel, and that's always been the case, but I think it's increasingly so now. It's kind of an old new challenge that I'm hearing a lot about from young people. It's mostly, but I would say it's those two for the most part.
Are you a rabbi at an Orthodox synagogue?
I served mostly Reform synagogues. I'm currently a member of a conservative synagogue in Maine. I'm hoping to pray here on Saturday in, I guess it's an Orthodox synagogue. Is it? The Choral Synagogue? Don't they have services on Saturday? Yeah. And is it a Chabad rabbi who runs that, or what?
Yes.
Yes.
Because the chief rabbi is from Chabad.
Yeah. So and that's who runs the service on Saturday?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So I pray anywhere. I don't identify with. I don't observe all of the mitzvot, but I don't make a distinction about what kind of Jew I am. I say I'm a Jew.
So women as rabbis is all right for you, right?
For me, yeah, women, gay, straight, what is that? Trans. Just be a good rabbi. Just be a good rabbi.
What makes a bad rabbi?
In my mind, I mean, if you have questionable ethics, if you manipulate people, if you take bribes. Yes.
Well, you've been Brooklyn rabbi and now Portland, East Coast, West Coast. You just like rap music. Right?
Yes. Portland, Maine, Stasis.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, I thought.
Yeah, no. Yes. Yeah, I don't know. West Coast, I don't know. I have very good friends who are rabbis on the West Coast. I'm not sure I could do it. Yeah, but but I will say that in general, on the East Coast, in the United States, people say you go to Maine to get away from everything. And what's true is that I have found, you're going to post this on YouTube. What's true I found amongst Jews of Maine is that it's a very warm community, but there is a sense that you even go away to get from a kind of Jewishness as well. Maine has its own particular expressions of what it means to be a Jew. It makes me miss Brooklyn, and the noise and the interruptions and the argumentation and the closed-endedness of it. I miss that. We're all we leave each other alone in Maine, which is nice, but for Jews, I like when we bother each other. Makes me feel Jewish, Yes?
You told a story about how Jews are traveled from Israel, how they traveled to United States and all that stuff. It was past story.
Yes. Yes.
Can you tell something about future? I mean, in terms of two states, Palestine and Israel, and about demographic changes, Israel, United States, just some visions.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I
understand that it's quite difficult now to say something.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
In case of war and
yes, yeah. I'll say two things. I assume that Philip Roth is represented in the library. Philip Roth, great American novelist, wrote a book called Operation Shylock. I don't know if you've ever read it or if it's translated into Lithuanian. It's an amazing book, and it was completely prophetic. Operation Shylock is set in Jerusalem, where Roth, the writer Philip Roth, is the character, and he's on a kind of, I can't remember if he's doing reporting or he's in Jerusalem, and he encounters a man named Philip Roth who's giving a lecture in Jerusalem. Because the writer Philip Roth, this man claims, is espousing a new philosophy of Jewish life called diasporaism. And he's encouraging people, because Israel will never be at peace, Zionism is a failed project, and you got to get the hell out now and go back to Europe. It's been enough years since the Shoah, and Jews now need to go back to Lithuania, back to Poland, back to Germany. And, it was classic Roth. It was brilliant and funny and crazy and unbelievable, except as Israeli politics and Israeli-Palestinian relations continued to deteriorate throughout the 90s, a lot of secular Israelis were saying, it's enough. We can't live this way. We can't raise our children this way. I mean, you're going to Berlin. There are so many Israelis in Berlin right now who've moved there permanently. And the Germans have actually been quite smart, I think, because, you know this from the history of Jews of Poland, Lithuania. kings, princes, right, monarchies would bring Jews to their lands in Europe for hundreds of years because they knew Jews were smart, were stable, came with money, came with investments, created business. So when things were good, bring the Jews in and our area will thrive. So to try to look at the future, and I'm a Zionist, I believe Israel should exist. I want there to be two states. I think the only solution is two states. The only way for Palestinians to live in peace is to let Israel live in peace, and the only way for Israel to live in peace is to let Palestinians live in peace. I don't have the solution right now for how to deal with all sorts of very complex questions related to coexistence, but I can tell you that people in 18 to 40 actually give me a lot of hope for ways in which they're trying to figure out possibilities for living together. So to try to answer your question directly, I think in a global world that's not melting, if we can stabilize the climate, I think there will be an enormous opportunity to see all sorts of new unexpected growth in areas of Europe that people thought Jews would never live in again. But it's actually happening. I walk around Vilnius now for the second time, and just to see the triumph over how this country is creating a whole new identity post-Soviet Union is unbelievable. To me, it's incredible. And I've seen some of the impulses for it on trips to Moscow that I've taken, and I've certainly seen it in Budapest. It's very inspiring to see kind of Europe, if you will, unleash itself from the oppressions of communism, frankly. And where that goes and what role Jews play in it is really interesting, because there's a tremendous opportunity in all of these cities. And there's something about the Jewish DNA which attracts us to opportunity. It's really quite fascinating and undeniable to see. And so I think similarly, when we go back to October 6th or October 5th, before the war began, what was on the table? And full stop, I believe that Netanyahu should be taken out of power. I think he should be jailed, okay? But what was happening right before the war broke out, was that Israel was about to totally regulate its relations with Saudi Arabia. The Abraham Accords have already brought an enormous change to the Middle East. Regular relations with Saudi Arabia would have changed that even more. The miscalculation was obviously leaving the Palestinians in the rearview mirror. Hamas wasn't willing to stand for. But I think that if you watch this shuttle diplomacy that's going on, you see the role playing both sides that Qatar is doing, but you see the unified Arab world. It's amazing if you really think about it. That Israel fought against all the Arab nations in 48, all the Arab nations in 67, basically all the Arab nations in 73. All the Arab nations have completely stayed on the sidelines in this fight. You've got the Houthis and you've got Hezbollah doing stuff. You've got Iran manipulating things from the outside. They're staying out of the fight. And part of that is because I think most Arab countries have accepted Israel's existence. A few, obviously Egypt, Jordan has normal relations, Abraham Accords, moving toward that. That's an inevitable change that's going to happen. So if the right leadership can be in place amongst Palestinians and amongst Israelis, I think that there can be actually a very strong, beautiful future of cooperation. I think it's actually possible. It requires, as an American Jew, it requires being able to marginalize the savage, racist expressions that come out of Israelis, that come out of Palestinians, that come out of Trump supporters. This fight is being fought all over the world, actually, against an eliminationist mindset, right? Trump wants to close the borders, deport everyone. Hamas charter wants to kill all the Jews. The settlers wants to transfer all the Palestinians. So eliminationist mindsets have to be fought against wherever we're living. And whether or not Israelis and Palestinians can pull themselves together and come up with some solution remains to be seen. But there are way too many people dying who shouldn't be dying because of assholes, basically. Sorry. Yes.
is doing a good job because it's recognized as one of the minority languages.
Mm.
In Lithuania, we also have like courses happening at Vilnius University of Yiddish language. But the station in Israel, I would say, is not as good as it is in Europe or the States.
Yes.
Because the station there is room, I would say. But in your opinion, what is the future of the language in the States if you would exclude New York and the Orthodox community there who thrives, who supports the language, but the station is outside of it?
It's a good question. You know, you can study Yiddish at the University of Wisconsin in the middle of the country. You can study it, I'm pretty sure, at Indiana University. So there are universities that are offering it. You know, New York has more to offer, but there are students studying Yiddish culture, Yiddish literature in universities. Yiddish social groups, Yiddish discussion groups, klezmer groups, right? These kinds of things are actually very increasingly popular amongst younger people. You know, it remains to be seen how much of it takes hold as a culture and whether or not 10, 15 years from now we're going to be seeing new volumes of Yiddish poetry being published, you know, or new original Yiddish music being composed. But there certainly are increases in the numbers of students studying it. How it is able to take hold, we just don't know yet. But the opportunities are there for sure. And you know, I mean, you might say, you know, to your question, going back to Tel Aviv, by the way, in 1910, with 52 families in Tel Aviv, right? Think of who actually spoke Hebrew, modern Hebrew, in 1910, right? 100 years later, the greater Tel Aviv area, 3.5 million Jews. Israel, 7.9 million Jews, and well over 3 to 4 million Arabs, Palestinians, all speak Hebrew. No one was speaking Hebrew, modern Hebrew, 120 years ago. So, you know, it's not impossible to imagine, you know, a kind of resurgence of spoken Yiddish. It's not impossible to imagine if it was impossible, you know, in the same way that, the resurgence of the Hebrew language is really frankly, one of the great miracles of Jewish history. No one ever would have imagined it. So you're right. You're right. Hebrew succeeded in rejuvenating itself because it was done in a concentrated area. There also was an enormous effort in the American Hebrew school system in the 30s and 40s and 50s. Like, you know, we did for a brief period of time, as a result of Zionism, drill Hebrew into American kids when you used to go to Hebrew school 3-4 days a week. I mean, no American Jewish parent could convince their kid. I couldn't convince a minute ago. I mean, going 2 days a week was a miracle. So, there's other stuff to do. So, but you're right. If there were enclaves, I suppose, you know, it could possibly take off. But you do. You need land, and you need language. This was what the early Zionist theorists knew. If we're going to save the Jewish people from anti-Semitism in Europe and assimilation and secularization in America, we need land and language. We're going back home. That was the basic premise of Zionism.
So I would just like
Yes?
if these are the conditions, then the future of the Yiddish language seems really weird, because you would have to separate Ashkenazim from other Jews in order to support that the language would survive. And I think the station can be similar to Ladino. You know, only a few people speak it.
Yes.
But I might be wrong also.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, look, you know, you can study Greek or Latin in university, but then you don't go out with your friends to a Greek restaurant, a Roman restaurant. But you can study Yiddish in university, and there's still a thriving Jewish culture around you in which you can use the Yiddish. And that's what's different, I think, about Jewish languages. You know, that they're ancient languages, or, you know, medieval into modern languages, as Yiddish is. But each of them are deeply embedded in contemporary Jewish life. Right? I'll probably speak, I don't know Lithuanian, so I imagine I'll speak Hebrew to the rabbi on Saturday, right? Because I'm assuming the Chabad rabbi is fluent in Hebrew. You know, so we'll speak to each other in Hebrew, you know, and we'll be in synagogue because we'll have a context to speak Hebrew in. If I'm studying ancient Greek at Columbia University, and I walk into a Greek diner on the Upper West Side and try to order my food in ancient Greek, he's just going to be like, what language are you speaking? Get out of here. What are you talking to me for? So I think that's a difference. Listen, it might not be able to be rebuilt, but when Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize in Literature, he was asked, what is it like to win the Nobel Prize in a dead language? And he said, there's a very long way to travel between dying and dead. A very Jewish answer, very Jewish answer, but nevertheless, I think poignant. Thank you all so much. Oh yes.
If you don't mind coming back a little bit to American Jews.
Yes.
As totality, which is very diverse, right? If we start with ultra-Orthodox Jews in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn, and then Reform synagogues, so there's a long list of various trends and directions and movements. And
yes.
So how Jews deal in between themselves, belonging?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. There were once many organizations that brought Jews from diverse backgrounds together, and now there are very few. The best examples I know, because of my recent experience of having lived in New York for more than 30 years, the Hasidic Jews of Williamsburg, who are Satmar, and the Lubavitch Jews of Crown Heights, who are Lubavitch, Chabad, don't talk to each other. Right? They live their lives according to their Rebbe's traditions, the Teitelbaums, the Schneersons, what have you. There are Orthodox Jews who are part of the decision-making body among what to do with the communal funds in the United States to support camps and schools and welfare programs and things like that. That's run out of what's called the federation system. And so there you will have Jews of different backgrounds sitting around the table contributing money and then making decisions about what to do with that charitable money. But for the most part, separate Jewish communities are speaking different languages. When 55% of Orthodox Jews vote Republican and are also fluent in Yiddish, many of them, and certainly in the Hasidic communities, and fluent in Hebrew, and very strongly pro-Israel, they have less and less in common with a Reform Jewish kid who goes to public school and doesn't speak those languages and never goes to synagogue and thinks, if I give $1 to a homeless person, I just did something Jewish because that's charity, that's tzedakah. So this is a very dark picture, but there is a way in which, and the studies show this, that different communities of American Jews are increasingly living kind of separate lives, separate paths. There isn't quite that sense of togetherness, except in the last 4 months. And you're seeing in the last 4 months with the Israel-Hamas war, not necessarily coming together over Israel per se, but coming together to protect against the huge rise in anti-Semitism that people are seeing. So there are expressions of solidarity that are being shown as a result of anti-Semitism. We are seeing that, which also, again, is not atypical for Jewish history. I mean, it's a horrible thing. It's a horrible reason to have to come together, but we are seeing that is part of what's happening. But in times of peace, for the most part, people kind of live separate lives. They're not really speaking the same Jewish language any longer. And that's a result of assimilationist trends and a lack of awareness and knowledge of language, which is a challenge for us. As Rabbi's fundamental role is to be a teacher in a community, and we all have to own up to a kind of failure on a certain level if we've not raised the next generation to hold language central to one's identity.
What do you call that trend or direction or movement, which should be called, which considers that going and settling in Israel is a sin because you would be allowed, it is okay to go to Israel only after Messiah comes.
Yeah.
And I saw news that there were even street fights and
Yeah. People like to make a lot of it. It makes a great photograph to see a Neture Karta, to see they're basically a sect of the Satmar rabbis. They're Satmar, they're Hungarian. So to see a tiny, tiny sliver standing at a pro-Palestine rally, people are like, yeah, see, Jews are against Zionism. It's a tiny sliver of Orthodox Jews. I mean, really. Yeah, I mean, it's there. But for the most part, my teacher, George Mossy, used to say about Zionism that Zionism was a social revolution against the rabbis. That the roots of the messianic idea go to the book of Samuel, when Saul and then David are anointed kings for the first time. Anointing, the Hebrew word for anointing a king is Mashiach. So you put oil on a king's head. I mean, it happened to King Arthur. It's how you anoint a king. You put some oil on their head. In Hebrew, that's called Mashiach, the anointed one. So this goes back to the book of Samuel in the Bible. The prophets begin to yearn, once after the first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, they yearn for the great line of David to come back and rescue the people from exile. So it's a yearning for Mashiach ben David. Let there be a new king in the line of David to come back and save us from this exile. This is the messianic idea. After the Roman period, the rabbis who inherit the Jewish tradition from priest, prophet, and king, by the first century, were already developing the idea of a messianic figure, that in the end of days, when we earn God's grace and are allowed to come back to the land, because we fundamentally, in religious Judaism, see exile, the ancient exiles, as punishment for our sins. There's a line in the book of Lamentations. For the sake of our sins, we were exiled from the land. The Jew, in ancient times, understood that if God is allowing us to be defeated and sent into exile, we must have done something wrong. And really, it's just amazing to look across at the faces of these, writers and poets and partisans, and I see Bialik. These are figures who rejected all of that. So we're not going to wait for the Messiah. We don't even believe in God. We're not going to wait. God's not saved us from the Khmelnytsky riots. God's not saved us from the pogroms. God didn't save us from Hitler. We're going back ourselves. That was Zionism. It was a rejection. And I think that's the vast majority of Jews aren't waiting for the Messiah. The vast majority of Jews, if we take these kinds of studies, at their surface level, the vast majority of Jews don't feel it's necessary to believe in God in order to be a good Jew. So the messianic idea doesn't really serve as a motivator, except for the most fundamentalist thinking. So the radical settlers in the West Bank who are, wreaking havoc on Palestinian families are doing so because they think this is land God gave us. And it's our responsibility as God's Jews to get these, Palestinians off the land. But this isn't, this idea is essentially rejected by the vast majority of world Jewry. It's an ancient idea that is, if you will, is considered primitive at this stage. It's not considered an advanced way of thinking for a human being. It's magical thinking, right? Messiah will come and make everything better. But there is a great phrase in the Talmud, this I will end on. Good idea? Yeah, wrap it up. There's a great teaching in the Talmud that says, if you're planting a tree by the side of the road and someone comes to tell you that the Messiah is coming, first finish planting the tree, then go greet the Messiah. So, here's to planting trees.